My mother-in-law told family services I was abusing my children. I made sure she never saw her grandchildren again. The caseworker stood in my living room at 7 in the morning, holding a clipboard and looking at my daughter's arms like they were evidence in a murder trial. Sophie was 5 years old and covered in bruises from climbing trees in our backyard, scrapes from learning to ride her bike without training wheels, and one spectacular purple mark on her shin from jumping off the swing set against my explicit instructions. The woman's name was Andrea Frost, and she wrote down every single mark while my daughter stood there in her pajamas looking confused and scared. My son Oliver sat on the couch clutching his stuffed elephant and watching with huge eyes that made him look even younger than 3. I tried to explain that kids get hurt when they play, that Sophie was fearless and athletic and constantly launching herself off things despite my warnings. Andrea nodded with this tight professional smile that meant she'd heard every excuse before and didn't believe any of them. She asked if I had documentation of the injuries, photos showing progression of healing, or witness statements from other adults who'd seen the accidents happen. I stared at her because who photographs their kids' scraped knees and bruises like they're building a legal defense? Normal parents put on Band-Aids and kiss it better and move on with their lives. The complaint had come from my mother-in-law Patricia 3 days earlier. She'd called the state child protection hotline and reported that her grandchildren were being physically abused by their mother, that she'd witnessed suspicious injuries during supervised visits, and that she feared for their safety. The supervised visits part was a lie since Patricia came to our house whenever she wanted and spent hours with the kids without me hovering over them. The abuse allegation was completely fabricated because I'd never laid a hand on my children in anger. But the system doesn't care about truth when the report first comes in. They care about covering their liability, checking every box on their forms, and making sure no child dies on their watch because they didn't investigate thoroughly enough. Andrea explained all this in a calm voice while going through my kitchen cabinets looking for I don't even know what. She opened the fridge and examined the contents, checked under the sink for cleaning products, and made notes about the safety locks on the lower cabinets. My hands shook while I stood there watching a stranger catalog my home like I was a suspect in my own life. My husband David was on a business trip in Seattle when this happened. I called him immediately after Andrea left and he didn't believe me at first. He kept asking if I was sure his mother had made the report, if maybe there was some mistake or misunderstanding. I told him the caseworker had confirmed Patricia's name as the reporting party and read back specific details only his mother would know. There was this long silence on the phone and then David said his mom would never do something like that. She loved the kids too much. I felt my chest get tight with rage and hurt because he was defending her before even hearing my side. I explained exactly what happened with Andrea examining our children and going through our house, and he finally seemed to understand this was real. He said he'd call his mother and get to the bottom of it. I told him to book the next flight home instead because we had a serious problem that couldn't be solved over the phone. He promised he'd be back by tomorrow afternoon and we'd figure it out together. After we hung up, I sat on my kitchen floor and cried while my kids watched cartoons in the next room, completely unaware that their grandmother had just tried to destroy our family. Patricia had never liked me from the moment David brought me home 8 years ago. I wasn't the right kind of woman for her precious only son. I came from a working-class family, my parents were divorced, and I'd put myself through community college while working nights at a diner. Patricia was old money Connecticut, country club memberships, and junior league meetings. She'd expected David to marry someone from their social circle, preferably the daughter of another wealthy family who understood their world. Instead, he fell in love with me at a coffee shop where I was studying for my nursing boards. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony that Patricia attended with a frozen smile and barely concealed disappointment. When I got pregnant with Sophie 2 years later, Patricia suggested we wait because we weren't financially stable enough. She meant I wasn't good enough to carry her grandchild. David shut her down hard that time, and we didn't speak to his mother for almost 6 months. But after Sophie was born, Patricia showed up at the hospital with expensive gifts and tears in her eyes, saying she just wanted to be part of her grandchild's life. The pattern started slowly with small criticisms disguised as helpful advice. Patricia would comment that Sophie's clothes didn't match or that I was feeding her the wrong kind of formula. She'd correct my parenting decisions in front of other people at family gatherings. She'd buy Sophie expensive toys and then make pointed remarks about how I couldn't afford things like that on a nurse's salary. David would get angry and defend me, but his mother had this way of crying and saying she was just trying to help, that she didn't mean to cause problems. His father Richard would intervene and smooth things over by suggesting we all needed to communicate better. I learned to gray rock her, giving minimal responses and refusing to engage with her provocations. When Oliver was born 3 years ago, Patricia started comparing the kids, saying Sophie was difficult, while Oliver was such an easy baby. She'd make comments about how Sophie got her stubbornness from my side of the family, while Oliver had the good temperament of David's lineage. The implicit message was always the same. I was contaminating her son's children with my inferior genetics and working-class values. The real trouble started 6 months ago, when David got promoted to senior management at his tech company. The new position came with a significant salary increase and stock options that would vest over 4 years. Suddenly, we had financial security I'd never experienced growing up. We paid off our student loans, put money into savings, and started looking at bigger houses in better school districts. Patricia's reaction was strange and intense. She became obsessed with David's newfound wealth, asking detailed questions about his compensation package and investment strategy. She suggested we move closer to her neighborhood so she could help more with the children. She offered to pay for Sophie's private school tuition at the academy where she served on the board. Every offer came with strings attached and expectations about how we'd live our lives. When David finally told his mother we were staying in our current neighborhood and keeping Sophie in public school, Patricia's mask slipped. She said we were making a mistake, that we didn't understand how to properly raise children in their new social class. David told her it wasn't her decision to make. She left our house that day without saying goodbye to the kids and didn't speak to us for 2 weeks. The reconciliation happened at a family dinner where Patricia apologized for overstepping. She said she just wanted the best for her grandchildren, and sometimes her enthusiasm got ahead of her judgment. But I noticed Patricia started asking weird questions after that. She'd examine Sophie's legs when she wore shorts and ask about every bruise or scratch. She'd quiz Oliver about whether Mommy ever got angry or raised her voice. She took photos of the kids constantly, zooming in on their faces and arms. I thought she was just being an overprotective grandmother documenting their childhood. Now I understand she was building a file, collecting evidence for the accusation she was planning. The realization made me physically sick when I connected all the pieces after Andrea's visit. Patricia had been laying groundwork for months, creating a narrative where I was an abusive mother whose violence was escalating. She'd probably documented every normal childhood injury and interpreted it through the lens of abuse. When she finally made the call to family services, she had a story ready that sounded credible because it was built on real observations, twisted into something sinister. David came home the next day looking exhausted and shell-shocked. He'd spent the flight reading everything he could find online about false abuse allegations and the family services investigation process. We sat at the kitchen table while the kids napped, and he held my hands across the worn wood surface. He said he'd called his mother that morning and confronted her directly. Patricia admitted making the report, but claimed she'd done it out of genuine concern for the children's safety. She said she'd noticed disturbing patterns in Sophie's injuries and believed I was hurting her during discipline. David asked her why she never said anything to him first if she was so concerned. Patricia's answer was that she knew he was blind to my faults because he loved me, and she couldn't stand by while her grandchildren suffered. David told her she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed and hung up on her. His hands trembled while he relayed the conversation, and I could see he was struggling with the reality that his mother had tried to destroy me. He kept saying he was sorry, that he should have protected me better from her manipulation over the years. I told him we needed to focus on protecting our kids now and dealing with the investigation before anything else. Andrea scheduled a follow-up visit for the following week after she'd completed her initial assessment. She wanted to interview both David and me separately, observe the children in our care, and review any medical records we could provide. David immediately called our pediatrician's office and requested copies of Sophie and Oliver's complete medical history. We scheduled appointments for both kids to be examined so we'd have recent documentation of their health. I started photographing every injury the moment it happened, with timestamps and detailed notes about circumstances. Sophie fell off the monkey bars at the playground 3 days after the initial visit and scraped both palms bloody. I took photos immediately, had 2 other mothers sign statements confirming they witnessed the fall, and documented everything in a notebook I bought specifically for this purpose. The whole thing felt insane, turning normal parenting into a criminal defense strategy. Oliver asked me why I was taking so many pictures, and I had to explain that sometimes grown-ups need to keep special records. I hated Patricia with an intensity that scared me. She'd turned my home into a surveillance state where I documented my children's injuries like I was expecting to be arrested. The pediatrician visit revealed something I hadn't considered. Dr. Helen Yoon had been treating my kids since birth and knew our family well. She examined both children thoroughly and confirmed they showed signs of normal childhood activity, not abuse. But she also mentioned that Sophie had slightly lower bone density than average, which made her more prone to bruising. It was nothing dangerous, just a minor variation that ran in some families and would likely normalize as she got older. Helen provided a detailed letter explaining the medical context for Sophie's frequent bruises and scraped knees. She included specific examples from Sophie's chart showing the pattern of injuries was consistent with an active child, not abuse. The letter was professionally devastating to Patricia's accusation because it came from a mandated reporter who would have been legally obligated to report if she'd seen actual evidence of abuse. Helen also mentioned off the record that she'd received a call from an elderly woman claiming to be Sophie's grandmother, asking questions about the children's medical history. Helen had refused to discuss anything without parental consent and documented the inappropriate contact attempt. I felt my stomach drop because Patricia had been trying to access medical records to build her case. Andrea's second visit was more thorough and invasive than the first. She interviewed David for over an hour, asking about our marriage, our parenting styles, and whether he'd ever witnessed me being physically aggressive with the children. When she interviewed me separately, the questions got more personal and accusatory. She asked if I'd ever lost my temper and hit the kids, if I used physical punishment as discipline, if I'd ever shaken them or thrown things near them. I answered no to everything with my voice steady even though I wanted to scream. She asked about my childhood and whether I'd experienced abuse growing up. I explained that my parents divorced when I was 12, but neither was abusive, just incompatible. She asked if I had any mental health diagnoses or history of depression or anxiety. I said no, because I'd never been formally diagnosed with anything, though I'd felt plenty of anxiety since Patricia made her false accusation. Andrea wrote everything down in her precise handwriting, and I wondered how my words would sound when transcribed into an official report. The observation period was awful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Andrea sat in our living room for 3 hours watching me interact with Sophie and Oliver. Every moment felt performative and strange, like I was acting the role of mother in a play where the audience was looking for me to mess up. I helped Sophie with her homework, made the kids a snack, and played a board game with them while Andrea observed and took notes. At one point, Sophie got frustrated with losing the game and threw her game piece across the room. I calmly retrieved it and explained that we don't throw things when we're upset. We use our words to express feelings. Andrea wrote something down, and I felt my heartbeat spike, wondering if my daughter's normal tantrum would be interpreted as evidence of a chaotic home environment. When Oliver bumped his head on the coffee table and started crying, I picked him up and comforted him while examining the small bump forming on his forehead. Andrea asked if I was going to photograph and document the injury. I said yes, and she nodded approvingly. The whole experience left me feeling hollowed out and paranoid about every normal parenting moment. David's parents requested a family meeting the week after Andrea's second visit. Richard called David directly and said they needed to discuss the situation like adults before it spiraled further out of control. David initially refused, but his father pressed, saying Patricia was his mother, and she deserved a chance to explain herself face to face. I told David I didn't want to be in the same room with Patricia, but he thought maybe we could resolve this if everyone just talked honestly. I reluctantly agreed on the condition that we met in a public place, not their house where Patricia would have home court advantage. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop on Saturday morning while David's sister Christina watched the kids. Patricia walked into the coffee shop wearing pearls and a silk blouse like she was attending a charity luncheon, not a confrontation about destroying her daughter-in-law's life. Richard followed behind, looking uncomfortable. We sat at a corner table and nobody ordered anything because this wasn't a social visit. Patricia started by saying she understood everyone was upset, but she'd only done what any concerned grandmother would do. She said she'd noticed concerning injuries on Sophie over several months and felt she had a moral obligation to report her concerns to the proper authorities. David cut her off and asked why she never came to us first if she was so worried. Patricia looked at him with this patient expression and said she'd tried to bring it up subtly, but I'd become defensive whenever she asked about the children's bruises. I felt rage bubbling up in my chest because that was a complete lie. She'd never once expressed concern to either of us, only made veiled criticisms about my parenting. I said that directly to her face, and she smiled sadly like I was proving her point about being defensive and unstable. Richard tried to mediate by suggesting maybe there had been miscommunications on all sides and everyone had acted with good intentions. David told his father this wasn't a miscommunication. It was a malicious false accusation that could result in our children being taken away. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, and she said she never wanted to hurt anyone. She just wanted to protect her grandchildren. The performance was masterful because she managed to position herself as the victim who was only trying to help. Richard reached over and patted her hand supportively, while giving David a look that said he was being too hard on his mother. I watched this dynamic play out and understood that nothing would be resolved here. Patricia wasn't going to admit she'd made a false accusation out of spite and control issues. She'd constructed a narrative where she was the concerned grandmother, and I was the abusive mother she'd heroically exposed. I stood up from the table and told David I was leaving because this conversation was pointless. Patricia called after me saying she hoped someday I'd understand she'd only been trying to help the children. I kept walking without looking back. The investigation concluded 3 weeks after the initial complaint with Andrea, officially closing the case as unfounded. She wrote in her report that there was no evidence of abuse or neglect, that the children appeared healthy and well cared for, and that the observed injuries were consistent with normal childhood activities. The pediatrician's letter about Sophie's bone density had been particularly helpful in explaining the frequent bruising. Andrea noted that the reporting party appeared to have made the complaint based on misinterpreted observations rather than actual abuse. The case was closed, and our names would not appear on any abuse registry. David and I held each other when we got the official letter, and I cried with relief. But the victory felt hollow because the process had been traumatic and invasive. I looked at my children differently now, hyper-aware of every injury and what it might signal to outside observers. Sophie had started asking why I took so many pictures, and whether the lady was coming back to watch us again. Oliver had nightmares about strangers taking him away from Mommy. Patricia's false accusation had poisoned our home with fear and paranoia, even though we'd been cleared. David told his parents the investigation results and informed them they would not be allowed contact with Sophie and Oliver until Patricia admitted she'd made a false accusation and apologized. Richard called me directly the next day, which surprised me since he usually worked through David. He asked if I really wanted to keep him from his grandchildren over a misunderstanding. I told him it wasn't a misunderstanding when someone calls the state and accuses you of child abuse knowing the accusation is false. He got quiet and then said maybe Patricia had overreacted, but her heart was in the right place. I said Patricia's heart was focused on controlling our family and punishing me for not being the daughter-in-law she wanted. Richard sighed and said family was supposed to forgive each other and move forward. I told him I'd forgiven a lot over the years, but this crossed a line into dangerous territory. Our children could have been removed from our home based on Patricia's lies. We could have lost them to the foster system while fighting to prove our innocence. That wasn't something I could just forgive and move past. Richard said he understood my position, but hoped I'd reconsider eventually for the sake of the children. I told him the children would be fine without grandparents who viewed their mother as an abuser. He hung up without saying goodbye. Patricia tried a different approach 2 weeks later by sending gifts to the house. A massive box arrived containing expensive toys for both kids, clothes in the next sizes up, and a handwritten card saying she missed them terribly. David sent everything back unopened with a note saying gifts were not a substitute for accountability. Patricia called him crying, saying she didn't understand why he was being so cruel, that she'd only ever wanted what was best for the family. David told her what was best would be admitting she'd filed a false abuse report and apologizing for the damage she'd caused. Patricia said she couldn't apologize for trying to protect her grandchildren from what she perceived as danger. The circular logic was maddening because she refused to acknowledge that her perception had been wrong. David told her until she could admit that she wouldn't be part of our lives. She called him ungrateful and said she'd sacrificed everything to raise him properly, and this was how he repaid her. He hung up on her mid-sentence. The threatening letter arrived 5 weeks after we'd cut off contact. It was addressed to David at our home and marked with a law firm's return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice that Patricia Whitmore was seeking grandparents' rights visitation under state law. The letter outlined Connecticut statutes allowing grandparents to petition for court-ordered visitation when they'd been denied access to their grandchildren. Patricia was claiming that our refusal to allow contact was harmful to Sophie and Oliver's well-being, and that she had an established relationship with them that should be legally protected. The law firm represented that Patricia was a loving grandmother being unreasonably excluded by hostile parents. The letter demanded we agree to a visitation schedule or face litigation. David read it 3 times with his face getting progressively redder. He called the law firm immediately and spoke to the attorney Patricia had retained. The lawyer was professional and unmoved by David's explanations about the false abuse accusation. He said his client had the right to pursue legal remedies, and they'd be filing the petition within the week unless we agreed to mediation. David told him to file whatever he wanted and hung up. I researched grandparents' rights law that night after the kids went to bed. Connecticut was one of several states that allowed grandparents to petition for visitation over parental objections, but the standard was high. The grandparent had to prove that visitation served the child's best interest and that denying it caused harm. Courts generally favored parental rights and were reluctant to override parents' decisions about who spent time with their children, but Patricia's lawyer wouldn't have taken the case if it was completely without merit. The false abuse accusation actually complicated things because Patricia could argue she'd made a good faith report based on genuine concerns. The fact that the investigation closed as unfounded didn't necessarily mean she'd acted maliciously, just that her concerns weren't substantiated. A family court judge might view the situation differently than the child protection system. I felt sick reading through case law and statute interpretations. Patricia was using the legal system to force her way back into our lives and our children's lives after we'd cut her off. David hired a family lawyer named Rebecca Chen the next day. We met with her that week in her downtown office and explained the entire situation from Patricia's history of boundary violations to the false abuse accusation to the grandparents' rights petition. Rebecca listened carefully and took detailed notes. When we finished, she leaned back in her chair and said we had a strong case, but it would be expensive and ugly. Patricia's petition would force us to litigate our family dynamics in court, with the judge deciding whether our decision to cut contact was reasonable. The abuse accusation would be central to the case, with both sides presenting evidence about whether Patricia had acted maliciously or out of legitimate concern. Rebecca said she'd seen these cases go both ways depending on the judge and how well each side presented their arguments. She estimated legal fees could run anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000 depending on how hard Patricia fought. David looked at me, and I nodded. We'd spend whatever it took to protect our children from his mother's manipulation. The petition was officially filed 2 weeks later, and we received notice that a hearing was scheduled for 3 months out. The court would appoint a guardian ad litem to represent the children's interests and conduct an independent evaluation. A social worker named Thomas Brennan was assigned to interview all parties, observe interactions, and make recommendations to the judge about whether visitation served the children's best interests. Thomas called to schedule his first visit, and I felt the familiar dread of having strangers in our home evaluating our parenting. The hearing was scheduled for early September, which meant we'd spend the summer preparing for trial while trying to maintain normal lives for Sophie and Oliver. Our lives revolved around fighting Patricia's attempt to force her way back into our family. Thomas Brennan turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd worked in child welfare for 20 years. He came to our house on a warm afternoon in late June and spent 4 hours with our family. He interviewed David and me together first, asking about our decision to cut off contact with Patricia and how the children had adjusted. We explained the false abuse accusation and showed him all the documentation from the investigation, including Andrea's closing letter. Thomas listened without much reaction and asked how we'd explained the situation to Sophie and Oliver. We told him the truth in age-appropriate terms. Grandma had made some mistakes and needed time away to think about her choices. Thomas asked if we'd consider supervised visitation as a compromise. I said absolutely not, because Patricia had proven she couldn't be trusted around our children. She'd used access to them to gather evidence for a false abuse claim. Allowing her back in any capacity risked her trying again if we didn't comply with her demands. Sophie was initially shy with Thomas, but warmed up when he asked about her interests. She showed him her gymnastics medals and demonstrated a cartwheel in the living room. Thomas asked if she missed seeing Grandma Patricia, and Sophie shrugged, saying sometimes, but mostly she was okay. Oliver was less verbal, but played contentedly with his toys while Thomas watched. Thomas asked both kids some general questions about whether they felt safe at home, if Mommy or Daddy ever got really angry, and whether anyone ever hurt them. Both children said no to anything concerning. After the observation, Thomas said the children seemed well-adjusted and happy, and our home environment appeared stable and loving. But he couldn't make a final recommendation without interviewing Patricia and observing her interaction with the children. Thomas conducted his evaluation of Patricia without us present, which meant we had no idea what she said or how she presented herself. Rebecca requested a copy of his notes afterward, and we reviewed them together in her office. Patricia had shown Thomas photo albums full of pictures with Sophie and Oliver from birth through last year. She'd cried when describing how much she missed them, and how painful it was being cut off from her only grandchildren. Patricia told Thomas she'd made the abuse report because she genuinely feared for Sophie's safety, based on the frequency and severity of bruising she'd observed. She admitted the investigation had cleared us, but maintained her initial concern had been legitimate. She claimed David had always been easily influenced by strong-willed women, and suggested I'd manipulated him into cutting off his own mother. Richard had been present during the evaluation and supported Patricia's version of events. He described me as defensive and controlling, someone who'd isolated David from his family over the years. Thomas's preliminary report was more neutral than I'd hoped. He acknowledged the abuse investigation had been unfounded, but noted Patricia's explanation of her concerns seemed sincere. He observed that Sophie and Oliver had talked about their grandmother with affection during his evaluation and appeared to have positive memories of time spent together. He recommended supervised visitation as a compromise that would allow the relationship to continue while protecting against any future false accusations. Thomas wrote that completely severing the grandparent relationship might be harmful to the children if Patricia had been a positive presence in their lives prior to recent conflicts. Rebecca called me after reading the report and said this was about what she'd expected. Thomas had to consider the children's perspective, and from their limited understanding, Grandma Patricia was someone they'd loved who suddenly disappeared. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early August to review Thomas's report and determine next steps. Rebecca filed a response arguing that supervised visitation was inappropriate, given Patricia's demonstrated willingness to weaponize her access against us. She outlined the pattern of boundary violations and control attempts over the years, culminating in the false abuse accusation. Rebecca emphasized that Patricia had never acknowledged wrongdoing or apologized, which meant allowing contact would signal that her behavior had no consequences. Patricia's lawyer filed his own brief arguing that grandparents' rights existed specifically for situations where parents were being unreasonable. He claimed we were punishing Patricia for exercising her civic duty to report suspected abuse, and that denying her relationship with the children harmed them emotionally. Judge Christina Wallace presided over the preliminary hearing on a humid morning in mid-August. She was a middle-aged woman with a reputation for being tough but fair on family matters. Rebecca said Wallace generally favored parental rights, but took grandparent relationships seriously when they'd been established over time. We sat at one table with Rebecca, while Patricia and Richard sat at another with their attorney, a silver-haired man named Donald Ashford. Judge Wallace reviewed Thomas Brennan's report and the written briefs from both sides. She asked Patricia's lawyer to explain why visitation should be granted over parental objection. Ashford gave a polished presentation about the important role grandparents play in children's lives and how Patricia had been an active presence for Sophie and Oliver since birth. He characterized the abuse report as a mistake, made out of excessive caution rather than malice. Rebecca countered by walking through Patricia's history of control and manipulation. She presented evidence of the unauthorized attempt to access medical records and highlighted that Patricia had never apologized or acknowledged the harm her false accusation caused. Rebecca argued that allowing visitation would reward Patricia's behavior and show our children that actions don't have consequences. Judge Wallace listened carefully and asked pointed questions of both attorneys. She asked Ashford how he'd advise his client about accountability if the goal was truly reuniting the family. He said Patricia stood by her actions as being motivated by concern for the children. Wallace raised an eyebrow at that and made a note. She asked Rebecca what remedy we'd accept short of permanent no contact. Rebecca said a full apology, an admission that the abuse accusation was false and malicious, along with Patricia agreeing to family therapy to address her boundary issues. Judge Wallace looked directly at Patricia and asked if she'd be willing to do that. Patricia hesitated, and then said she couldn't apologize for trying to protect her grandchildren. The courtroom went silent. Judge Wallace said she was troubled by the case because while she believed in preserving grandparent relationships, she also recognized that parents had fundamental rights to make decisions for their children. The false abuse accusation was serious regardless of whether it was made with good intentions or malicious intent. The fact that Patricia refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing even when directly asked by the court was concerning. However, the children's relationship with their grandmother had existed for years and shouldn't be severed without careful consideration. Wallace said she was ordering a more comprehensive evaluation by a child psychologist to assess whether contact with Patricia would actually harm Sophie and Oliver or whether supervised visitation could be beneficial. The case would proceed to full trial in 6 weeks, with the psychologist's report given significant weight in her final decision. The child psychologist was named Dr. Vivian Torres, and she specialized in family dynamics and child development. She scheduled individual sessions with Sophie and Oliver at her office, which was decorated with toys and bright colors to make kids comfortable. Dr. Torres also requested individual interviews with David, me, Patricia, and Richard. The evaluation would take 3 weeks to complete with a written report due to the court 1 week before trial. Rebecca said Dr. Torres' findings would likely determine the outcome of the case. If she concluded contact with Patricia would harm the children, Judge Wallace would probably rule in our favor. If she found supervised visitation wouldn't be harmful, we'd likely lose and be forced to allow some form of contact. My interview with Dr. Torres was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, and I took the time off work. She asked me to describe my relationship with Patricia from the beginning, and I walked through 8 years of tension, criticism, and escalating control attempts. I explained how Patricia had never accepted me as good enough for her son, and had spent years trying to undermine my parenting and influence our family decisions. Dr. Torres asked how the abuse accusation had affected me, and I answered honestly. It had been traumatic being investigated by the state, having a stranger examine my children, and question my fitness as a mother. I'd developed anxiety around normal parenting moments, constantly worried about how things might look to outside observers. The trust between my children and me had been damaged by their awareness that someone might take them away. Dr. Torres asked if I'd be willing to eventually reconcile with Patricia under any circumstances. I said not unless she genuinely acknowledged what she'd done and worked to change her behavior. But I didn't believe she was capable of that level of insight or accountability. Dr. Torres submitted her report to the court 3 days before trial, and Rebecca received a copy that same afternoon. She called us immediately and said we needed to meet in person to discuss the findings. We drove to her office that evening after arranging childcare and sat in her conference room while she pulled up the 30-page document on her laptop. Dr. Torres had concluded that while Sophie and Oliver had positive memories of their grandmother, contact with Patricia at this time would not serve their best interests. The report outlined several key findings. First, Patricia demonstrated a pattern of boundary violations and control attempts that had escalated over time. Second, her refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing regarding the false abuse accusation indicated a lack of insight into her behavior's impact. Third, the children had adjusted well to the no-contact period and showed no signs of distress about their grandmother's absence. Fourth, supervised visitation risked reinforcing Patricia's belief that her actions were justified and that she could manipulate systems to override parental decisions. Dr. Torres recommended maintaining the no-contact order until such time as Patricia engaged in meaningful therapy and demonstrated genuine behavior change. Rebecca smiled for the first time since we'd hired her and said this report was about as strong an endorsement of our position as we could hope for. Dr. Torres had seen through Patricia's performance and understood the underlying manipulation. The recommendation carried significant weight because it came from a court-appointed neutral expert who had no agenda other than the children's well-being. The trial was scheduled for the following Monday and would likely last 1 full day. Both sides would present evidence and testimony, including the option to call witnesses. Rebecca wanted to call our pediatrician as a witness to discuss the medical context for Sophie's bruising and Patricia's inappropriate attempt to access records. She also wanted me to testify about the history of boundary violations. The trial began at 9 Monday morning in the same courtroom where we'd had the preliminary hearing. Patricia's lawyer went first, presenting his client's case for court-ordered visitation. Ashford called Patricia to testify, and she took the stand wearing a conservative dress and pearls. She testified about her relationship with Sophie and Oliver from their births, describing birthday parties and holidays and everyday moments she'd shared with them. She showed emotion when talking about being cut off and how much she missed her grandchildren. Ashford asked about the abuse report, and Patricia explained that she'd seen concerning bruises and felt obligated to report her observations to authorities. She said she'd never intended to cause problems but had a duty to protect vulnerable children. Ashford asked if she regretted making the report, and Patricia said no, because she'd rather err on the side of caution when a child's safety might be at risk. Rebecca cross-examined Patricia with surgical precision. She asked Patricia to describe specific instances of boundary violations and control attempts over the years. Patricia denied most of them, or characterized them as helpful suggestions, rather than overreach. Rebecca presented evidence of Patricia's unauthorized call to the pediatrician's office attempting to access medical records. Patricia claimed she'd just been trying to understand the situation better. Rebecca asked why she'd called the pediatrician before making the abuse report if she was so concerned about the children's safety. Patricia fumbled and said she'd wanted to gather complete information. Rebecca pointed out that gathering information about a suspected abuse victim without the parent's knowledge suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous concern. Patricia's composure cracked slightly, and she said she didn't appreciate having her motives questioned when she'd only tried to help. Rebecca asked if Patricia had ever apologized to David or me for the trauma caused by the investigation. Patricia said she hadn't because she didn't believe she'd done anything wrong. Rebecca asked if Patricia understood that a false abuse accusation could have resulted in the children being removed from their home. Patricia said the investigation had cleared us, so no harm was actually done. Rebecca sat down without another word. Richard testified next, describing Patricia as a devoted grandmother and characterizing me as controlling and vindictive. Rebecca's cross-examination exposed that Richard had no independent knowledge of most events he described and was simply supporting his wife's narrative. When Rebecca asked if Richard had ever witnessed me being abusive toward the children, he admitted he hadn't. When she asked if he'd observed the specific bruises that concerned Patricia enough to call the state, he said no. His testimony fell apart under scrutiny, and by the end he just looked like an elderly man trying to support his wife's losing battle. Dr. Yoon was an excellent witness who spoke with authority and compassion. She described treating Sophie and Oliver since birth and explained the medical context for Sophie's frequent bruising. She testified that the pattern of injuries was completely consistent with an active child with slightly lower bone density, not abuse. She provided specific examples from her records showing the variety and location of injuries over time. Yoon testified that as a mandated reporter, she'd never seen anything that concerned her about our family. She described Patricia's unauthorized call attempting to access medical information and characterized it as inappropriate and concerning. When Ashford cross-examined her, he tried to suggest that mild bruising could sometimes mask more serious abuse. Yoon shut that down quickly, explaining that she'd examined both children multiple times, including during and after the investigation period, and saw no evidence of abusive injury patterns. I took the stand last, and Rebecca walked me through 8 years of history with Patricia. I testified about specific instances of criticism and boundary violations, the escalating control attempts after David's promotion, and the devastating impact of the false abuse accusation. I described what it felt like having a caseworker examine my home and question my fitness as a mother. I explained how I documented my children's injuries now like I was expecting to be arrested, how Sophie asked why I took so many pictures, how Oliver had nightmares about being taken away. I testified that cutting off contact with Patricia wasn't vindictive. It was protective. She'd proven she couldn't be trusted around our children because she used access to them as weapons when we didn't comply with her wishes. I said I'd be willing to reconsider in the future if Patricia genuinely acknowledged her behavior and worked with a therapist, but she'd shown no willingness to do either. I wasn't going to expose my children to someone who saw nothing wrong with making false accusations to manipulate her family. Ashford's cross-examination tried to paint me as oversensitive and controlling. He asked if I'd ever tried family therapy with Patricia to resolve conflicts. I said no because Patricia didn't believe she had conflicts to resolve. He asked if cutting off contact was proportional to the offense or whether I was using the abuse accusation as an excuse to exclude Patricia permanently. I said having the state investigate you for child abuse wasn't a minor offense. He asked if I'd considered how the children might feel in the future knowing I'd denied them a relationship with their grandmother. I said I'd considered how they'd feel if their grandmother made another false accusation and they ended up in foster care while we fought to get them back. Ashford paused at that and tried a different angle. He asked if I'd ever specifically told Patricia I didn't want her involved in our children's lives. I said I'd told her repeatedly through words and actions when she overstepped boundaries, but she ignored those messages because she believed her judgment superseded ours as parents. Closing arguments were brief because everyone was exhausted and the case had been clearly presented. Ashford argued that grandparents' rights existed to protect important relationships from being severed by hostile parents. Rebecca argued that parental rights were fundamental and should only be overridden in extreme circumstances. This wasn't a situation where we were being arbitrary or cruel. We were protecting our children from someone who demonstrated she'd weaponized systems against us. Dr. Torres's report supported our position and should be given substantial weight. Judge Wallace said she'd review all evidence and testimony carefully and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. Rebecca called on a Friday afternoon 12 days after trial. Her voice was careful and professional when she said Judge Wallace had issued her ruling and we should come to her office to review it together. David left work early and we drove to Rebecca's office in tense silence. We sat in her conference room and Rebecca pulled up the 10-page decision on her laptop. She turned the screen toward us and said we'd won. Judge Wallace had ruled in our favor, denying Patricia's petition for grandparents' rights visitation. The decision outlined several key findings. First, the court found that we'd established legitimate reasons for cutting off contact based on Patricia's pattern of manipulation and the false abuse accusation. Second, Judge Wallace gave significant weight to Dr. Torres's report, concluding that visitation wouldn't serve the children's best interests at this time. Third, the court emphasized that parental rights were fundamental and shouldn't be overridden except in extraordinary circumstances. Patricia had failed to meet her burden of proving that denying visitation caused actual harm to the children. Fourth, Judge Wallace noted Patricia's refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing or apologize demonstrated a concerning lack of insight that made supervised visitation risky. The court was declining to order any form of contact, but leaving open the possibility that Patricia could file a new petition in the future if circumstances changed substantially. I read the decision 3 times before the relief finally hit me. We'd won. Patricia couldn't force her way back into our lives through the legal system. Our decision to cut off contact had been validated by a judge who understood the full context. David put his head down on the table, and I could see his shoulders shaking. We'd been carrying this weight for 7 months, and finally it was lifted. Rebecca said Patricia had 30 days to file an appeal, but she doubted Ashford would advise that given how thoroughly Judge Wallace had ruled against them. We'd still owe legal fees totaling about $28,000, but it was worth every penny to protect our family. 6 months passed before I thought about Patricia without feeling immediate anger. Time and distance had given me perspective on how close we'd come to losing everything. Sophie thrived in kindergarten and made friends easily. Oliver grew more verbal and started asking endless questions about everything. David got another promotion, and we moved to a bigger house in a better school district. Life moved forward the way it does when you're not constantly fighting battles with toxic family members. I still documented injuries when they happened, but the paranoia had faded. The investigation was closed, and we'd been vindicated in court. Nobody was coming to take my children. The envelope arrived on a cold morning in February, almost a year after the initial abuse accusation. Inside was a single-page letter written in Patricia's precise script. She wrote that she'd spent the past months in therapy working through her behavior and was beginning to understand the harm she'd caused. She said she'd been operating from a place of fear and control, trying to hold on to her son and grandchildren through manipulation rather than building genuine relationships. The abuse accusation had been the culmination of years of her refusing to respect boundaries because she believed she knew better than everyone else. She wrote that she was sorry for the pain and trauma she'd inflicted on our family. She didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for contact. She just wanted us to know she was working to become a better person and hoped someday in the distant future we might consider allowing supervised visits with appropriate therapeutic support. The letter ended without demanding a response or timeline, just an acknowledgement that she understood the damage was her responsibility to repair. I read it twice and then showed it to David. We looked at each other, and I could see he was feeling the same complicated emotions I was, cautious hope mixed with deep skepticism and lingering hurt. Either way, it wasn't our problem to solve right now. We'd protect our children first and consider reconciliation later if Patricia proved through sustained action that she'd actually changed. For now, the letter went into a drawer and we went back to living our lives. Our kids were safe, our family was intact, and Patricia would never hurt them again.